I'm double vaccinated. I'm confident of the safety of the vaccine. But of course, no vaccine is without risk. And it's important to be grown up and honest about that, Tess, as people consider whether to have the jab.
Yes, I would agree with you.
In that case, and with that in mind, do you think that there is any concern about misinformation around the vaccine that could cause vaccine hesitancy when there is no reasonable reason to be afraid of it?
Well, I've looked at the evidence, the data on the yellow card system, and I think there is reason to actually pause and ask the government for more information on these adverse events, because we've got the data up until the end of June, and it shows that 300,000 people have reported adverse events or side effects with the vaccines.
And this, though, is relatively normal, is it not, in relation to vaccinations? And do you think that the main...
Not at all, actually. I would just say it's not normal. If you take a vaccine like the tetanus vaccine, which has been around since 1968, there's only, 36 deaths reported attributed to it on the World Health Organization's database, whereas there's 7,000 deaths reported against the COVID vaccines in just a few months on the World Health Organization database. And on the UK's database, there's 1,440. So this is unprecedented, I would say, in the history of any medicine, to have so many deaths reported in such a short time, and indeed so many reports in such a short time against a medicine.
What are your thoughts, Dr. Laurie, on the vaccination of over 12s?
Well, I think they're really unnecessary and dangerous, because a child has more chance of dying from a vaccination, looking at these figures, than they do from COVID.
And what about getting COVID itself? Because perhaps the relatively small risk of the vaccine is better than getting COVID. We've heard about long COVID. It's certainly a nasty virus, isn't it? And perhaps best avoided.
Well, I think we all have robust immune systems. If you're not vulnerable and you're not very elderly, our immune systems are geared up to deal with viruses, bacteria, and others. So I think a lot of the side effects that we see with COVID, the long COVID and so on, can be prevented by early treatment. So we know with ivermectin, the earlier you treat, the better, and the doctors using it say that you don't get long COVID if you treat with ivermectin, in the very early stages of COVID. So if you've got a treatment for COVID, you don't have to be afraid of COVID. Well, I think we have very little safety data on these vaccines. They're only under emergency use authorization. They haven't gone through the rigorous safety studies and the time. So they haven't gone through the rigorous, the 10-year period where it takes to develop and follow up. And we don't have the data. We just don't. Studies like randomized controlled trials are all very well for telling you whether something's effective, but it doesn't really tell you whether something's safe. Safety data is what you get from these pharmacovigilance databases and long-term follow-up.
It's none of my business, Dr. Laurie, but would you care to share with my listeners whether you've had the vaccine or not?
Well, as I say, I always use the precautionary principle in my practice, as well as and I take responsibility for my own health. And I would like to see more safety data and more long-term safety data before taking this vaccine.
And you don't take the view that a pause on the vaccine rollout prolongs this nightmare, the COVID restrictions, lockdowns, and all the rest of it?
Not at all, because ivermectin actually works for prevention and treatment. So there are doctors around the world who've been taking ivermectin for a year already, and they take it prophylactically, and they haven't become sick. And there are many studies showing that if you roll it out to health professionals who are very at high risk, they do not get sick. So we have something that's very safe and effective that works for prevention and treatment, and there are other medicines that can be used for treatment. So in actual fact, there's no harm in pausing the vaccination program and saying, let's take a good look at these data, because ivermectin can actually end this pandemic. Well, the yellow card system is the UK's reporting system. It's been around for many years. It's not set up specifically for vaccinations. And its mandate is to encourage people and doctors to report adverse events that they think are associated with a drug. And for the vaccines, it's now, there's a government website where you can go and report just like theirs. But the difference is that the data are not that easily visible or available. And the government reports them as PDF documents for each vaccine. So for AstraZeneca, Pfizer, and Moderna separately. And these documents are 70 pages or more. And they just list a series of adverse events, and there's often sort of overlap. It's hard to get a big picture of what's actually going on, because they also report it per category. So it'll be cardiac, gastrointestinal, nervous system, reproductive system. And for an average doctor who hasn't got the time to wade through these big documents, which get overwritten each week, it's not easy to get a picture of what's going on if you're interested in knowing, is there an issue with clotting, for example. So what we did was we put in search terms. I've had great help from volunteers who have extracted the data for us and developed a system that we can extract it now from the PDFs going forward. And we used, for example, search terms related to bleeding, clotting, and ischemic disorders. Ischemia is like occlusion that leads to lack of blood flow and oxygen, and strokes and heart attacks. So we put in terms like that to identify one specific type of problem, a specific group of problems. We put in other search terms that were specific to neurological issues. We also looked at pain as an issue, because glancing across these documents, you could see that there was pain happening in lots of different, in all the systems really, in all those. So we just looked at it in a different way so that we could write a report for GPs that would make it easily accessible and digestible. And it was really quite surprising what we found. I'll just show you a screen. I'll just show you what we found from the bleeding, clotting, and ischemic analysis. And I'm actually going to show you a word cloud.
Definitely. And while you are doing that, there has been, when I started talking about clotting, there was so much pushback to me to say, why do you think that these are the vaccines that are causing it? And they thought it is somehow a baseline background clotting percentage, which is also showing up in the vaccinated people as well. Did you see, so while you're going to talk about this, did you see any uptick in clotting and then some association or cause with vaccine, or this is just a possible coincidence?
It's definitely not a coincidence. I think what this is, it's a common misunderstanding, I think, that these things are coincidences. If someone's reporting an event on the yellow card system, it really must be taken seriously, because a person knows their body better than anybody else. And a doctor knows their diagnoses. So if they think it's related to the vaccine, well, that needs to be considered to be true until proven otherwise, not the other way around. You don't look at the background data and say, oh, well, we usually have this many cases of heavy menstrual bleeding, for example, and so these women don't know that, they don't know their cycles, and we don't really believe them. We don't need to pay attention to this, especially in the context of these experimental, this emergency use authorization, which these medicines, these injections are still experiments. They're not fully approved, and they haven't gone through the rigorous safety evaluation of a normal new medicine. So we really need to pay attention to those, and we really need our authorities to pay attention to them too. So I just wanted to show you this slide because in the UK, on the government report, they talk about cerebral venous sinus thrombosis, which you can see at the top here. And this is a very unusual type of clotting diagnosis in the brain. And you can see with a word cloud, the largest font represents the most common, or the highest number of events. So you can see on here, cerebral venous sinus, it's occurring and it's very serious, but there are other serious things also. That we've got cerebral hemorrhage, myocardial infarction, hemorrhage or transient ischemic attack, very common. It's like a mini stroke, but your function returns. Postmenopausal hemorrhage. These things are very distressing. I mean, look here, we've got pulmonary embolism, which is much more common than cerebral venous sinus thrombosis. And in fact, there's a number of fatalities on our systems relating to pulmonary embolism. Cerebrovascular accident, that's a stroke. There are more strokes than cerebral venous sinus thrombosis. So, from my point of view, looking at the government report and looking what's actually on the yellow card system, on the database, they're kind of cherry picking the cerebral venous sinus thrombosis when there's all this other very serious deep vein thrombosis, very serious clotting, and then this heavy menstrual bleeding, which is very distressing for women, and vaginal hemorrhage and postmenopausal hemorrhage. So, there seems to be a sort of undermining of the seriousness of what's actually being reported. I'm going to just see what my next slide is. I can't remember. There we go. Oh yes, so this is what the government report says about menstrual disorders. It says a range of menstrual disorders have been reported, including heavier than usual periods. And then it says here the number of reports of vaginal disorders and menstrual disorders and vaginal bleeding is low in relation to both the number of females who have received COVID to date and how common menstrual disorders are generally. This is a completely inappropriate way to look at the data on a pharmacovigilance database, because these are not just the general, it's not just the general incidents being reported. These are people who have these events reported because of their association with the vaccine.
And this is exactly my point was as well, that when I started talking about it, I got so much pushback saying, hey, this is background occurrences, and that is happening here as well. And then eventually we have reached a point that I think we can acknowledge that there is a causation, there is a strong association with the vaccines. My question to you is this: if we think about your previous slide, and yes, when you say that they talk about clotting or the venous thrombosis, and there are bigger issues that are out there, do you think that is deliberate to kind of make us look somewhere else, or that is just being less prepared because they don't care for what is happening?
I think it seems to be a very uncomfortable truth that these vaccines are a mistake. They've been released too early. We do not have all the data, and I've never seen a list of adverse events like we are seeing on these databases. Let me find another slide for you if you don't. Well, okay. Well, this is of the fatalities. So you can see pulmonary embolism is a major cause for fatality, far more than cerebral venous sinus thrombosis. If you look at the size of the font, cerebral venous sinus thrombosis actually is relatively less important on the list of deaths compared with pulmonary embolism, and we've had no discussion or heard nothing in the news about that. If I stood on a rusty nail tomorrow, I'd go and get a tetanus jab. But I will not put these experimental medicines into my body, because tetanus on the pharmacovigilance database of the WHO has got 36 deaths since 1968. So I don't know how many decades that is, like 50, 60 years or something. 14,000 or so adverse events, whereas on their database, they've got 7,000 deaths. It's just one database. 7,000 deaths from the COVID vaccines just the last few months, this year, since the vaccine started, and well over 1 million adverse event records. And that's just one database. The European database is showing the same thing, more deaths. I think it's more like 15,000 deaths and 1 million. We're looking at 4 million adverse event records now across these major databases, and probably in the region of 30,000 recorded deaths. So this is way beyond, this is not a normal vaccine. This is a very harmful vaccine, and the rollouts need to be stopped.
So this is not just related to meaning it's not just a nurse's fault.
No, and it's not one type of vaccine versus another. There's not one that is better than another. There are different adverse events, I think, emerging. There's a preponderance of certain types of adverse events emerging associated with the different vaccines, but they all cause clotting, and they all cause neurological adverse events, and they all cause allergic and immune suppression, because what we're seeing on these databases is a lot of reactivation of latent viruses, which suggests immune suppression, not immune boosting. So we're seeing cases, a lot of shingles, which comes after chicken pox, and usually it comes when you're a bit stressed or your immune system's down. We're seeing herpes reactivations. We even in the UK, there's even a case of rabies, which is a latent virus and comes, can reactivate at any stage. So, the range of adverse events is huge, and it shows. It really looks like multi-system inflammation. It looks like COVID. And that's not surprising if you think about it, because with COVID, the harm, the clotting problems, the allergic kind of lungs, multi-system inflammation, the brain fog and all that, the long COVID, that's related to the spike protein in the most, the most
levels.
Yeah. So now what we're doing with this vaccine is it's actually providing your body with a recipe to make spike protein, and we know spike protein causes the damage with COVID. So now we have a spike protein that's circulating, and it can cause similar. And we're seeing this same sort of picture. We're seeing the clotting. We're seeing this multi-system inflammation, the allergic kind of stuff. And so, in my opinion, the same sorts of remedies and combination therapies that help people with COVID would probably help people suffering from adverse events from the vaccines. But in terms of what could be causing the damage, we've already spoken about the spike protein, and that is something that's manufactured. Doesn't matter what type of vaccine you're getting, its aim is to get your body making the spike protein. But there's also other additives to these vaccines, and it's not clear what these are. And these need to be made clear and publicly available, so we know what these things are in the different vaccines, because equally they might be causing allergic reactions or this inflammation. Are they new substances? Do they cause inflammation? We just don't know. People who are listening, go on to vigiaccess.org, type in ivermectin. You can look at the range of adverse events that have occurred since 1992. And then...
what is this?
So it's vigiaccess.org. And then you just check the little box at the bottom there. Do you see on behalf of? And yeah, and then type in there ivermectin. Okay, so you can see there's 5,000. It's quite small, but I can see 5,500 and something, I think, adverse records retrieved. And then if you click on adverse drug reactions, so that's the total number of records, okay? And then go to general disorders. Click on the general disorders there, Dr. Bean. And then scroll down. There, you see death. So you'll see death. There's 20 deaths there. And then just you can go.
And this is since ivermectin has been used. 3.75 billion doses.
Yes, since 1992. You can find out where that. So there's another graph. If you go out of that menu and scroll down and go to ADR reports per year. So you'll see there are more reports more recently because it's being widely used. But if you just scroll down there, go down to the bottom of the page, you'll see that these are summed up since 1992. So let's do the same exercise for the COVID-19 vaccines.
Are they here?
You literally put in COVID-19 vaccine. They're not divided categorized according to the type of vaccine. So there, look, it's 1 million. It says 1.35 million records, and that's just since December or something. If you go adverse events and look at general disorders, and there's 7,263 deaths. That's just and there are far more doses of ivermectin that have been given than this vaccine. And people receiving vaccines are not, they're not sick people, generally speaking. It's a prophylaxis. Remember, it's given for prevention of disease. And then there's another interesting thing on the site. If you just go out of that section, it's really interesting. If you want to look at, so the question asked by that chap was what about neurological and liver? So we won't look at that now, but I invite him to go and have a look and scrutinize the adverse events associated with the vaccines, and then see which medicine he'd rather take. But what is interesting here is if you look at age group distribution and also patient sex distribution. So age group distribution, you can see the majority of adverse events reported here are occurring between 18 and 44 years. So these aren't adverse events that are occurring only in old people. These are adverse events that are occurring in just, between 18 and 44 years, you've got more than 70% of adverse events occurring between 18 and 64 years on the site. And you can see there's even some adverse events reported for babies there. And then do you see up to 27 days? And then if you look at the sex distribution, 71% of these records are occurring, have been reported in women, which is very worrying.
Byram Brittle did a freedom of action request of the Japanese government for the Pfizer data, and he got a biodistribution chart. And I'm pretty sure I linked to the original data in my paper. And this graph was created from that Pfizer data. So this is not the Pfizer data itself from the Pfizer study. This is a graph, and people have double-checked and triple-checked this.
Yeah, it's a summary graphic.
It's a summary graph so that you can see it visually.
I did review the primary data, and I concur that the primary data is consistent with the graph that you have nicely summarized.
Right. And so what you see from this graph is that when you inject in the shoulder, these...
Do you want to walk through teach the listener how it shows that?
How it shows what?
What you're just saying.
So some people will just listen to this. So what we're looking at is a graph of different lines of concentration of, is this spike protein in various tissues? No.
Yes, it's a lipid nanoparticle.
Oh, it's the lipid nanoparticle, which is the delivery mechanism.
Right. It's like the Fed.
It is the drug.
Well, for people at home, it's the box. It's the box in which the mRNA.
It's a proxy for the drug. So the mRNA is what causes the manufacture of the spike protein. But if you find the lipid nanoparticles, that tells you that your drug got to this location.
Right. It's the delivery box, effectively. It's the FedEx delivery box that has the mRNA inside.
This is, you're exactly right. This is the lipid component.
Yeah.
That does the delivery.
Okay, so good. So what we've got here are different lines that tell you over time from a quarter of an hour to 48 hours where you find what the concentration in various tissues are. And you've got some strong signals here. You've got it in whole blood, not surprisingly, over the first 4 hours. In other words, it's moving around, it's circulating.
That in and of itself is unusual
and concerning.
Right, it should be in the interstitial fluid.
So the forgive me, just to get a little more precise, we've administered by needle into the deltoid of this complex.
Yep.
And you're just tracking the lipid part of it now. There's also an RNA part of it. But as you say, it quickly moves into the blood. Plasma is the cell-free fraction. That's the yellow mustard line. And the gray line is whole blood. So that includes the cellular part of blood.
Yep.
Okay. Carry on.
Okay. And then we get lines that rise. So all of these things decline as basically this diffuses through the body, which actually is not what you would hope. You would hope it would stay in the arm, but it's basically diffusing through the body. So concentrations are dropping as it gets more and more evenly distributed. And then concentrations are rising conspicuously in two places as we close in on 48 hours. One of them is in the ovaries, where it goes sky high. That's really frightening.
Anybody that's looked at this data says, what?
Yeah, that is a very frightening signal.
And it's the cognitive dissonance between what the CDC says is that this is safe for pregnant women.
Right.
This is perfectly safe, and it's on the CDC website. It's unbelievable.
At some level, it's not safe for women at all. I mean, this is
right.
So before we interpret the data, let's make sure your listeners understand it.
Okay, so the ovaries show a high concentration. For whatever reason, it's ending up in the ovaries preferentially. Yes, the lipid is ending up there. And then the other place that we have a signal, which I think suggests something we need to worry farther down the road. You tell me, Robert, if I'm on the right track here or not. But the fact that it shows up concentrating in bone marrow.
Bad news.
Actually, that suggests that you could end up with, I'm not saying this is going to happen, but I'm saying we need to look for something like leukemias showing up here because of their creation in bone marrow. I know from other work that it also seems to show up preferentially in lymph nodes, which raises the question of whether or not lymphomas might be created. In any case, these are possible long-term effects that we have no way of knowing don't arise because these things have not been injected into people for more than a year.
So we have two adverse event signals that are starting to become apparent, my friends at the FDA tell me.
Okay.
That are relevant to what you're saying. You're focusing on bone marrow.
Mm-hmm.
So typically aplastic anemia, leukemia, lymphoma, those kinds of things might, if there is going to be a signal, we might see it 6 months, 3 years, 9 years. Okay, hard to tell because this is a progression of cancer that often requires multiple mutations.
Yep.
Okay. So let's just park that.
Yep.
It is a risk. It is a risk that should be monitored.
Well, wait a second. Well, you said somebody is beginning to see a signal of something, but I didn't get what it was.
Yeah. So I was going to get into that.
Okay.
There's two signals that are starting to, and we don't have time to go into the nuance of how come it takes so long for them to figure out what's going on.
Yeah.
Okay. But one of them is thrombocytopenia. That's not having the platelets.
Okay.
Which are manufactured in the bone marrow.
So right now we're focusing on bone marrow signals. Okay. Thrombocytopenia is one of them. Another one that is very hard to understand that's starting to come up in the database is reactivation of latent viruses.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so this is shingles. Shingles is an example of that, but there are many others, and there's something in the literature about reactivation of latent human retroviruses. Okay, so it is there are anomalous findings cropping up, and I concur that it was when I received these data to evaluate. I gave you that whole story. Okay, those are two of the things. And by the way, what's really odd to me about the ovarian signal is there's no signal in the testis.
Right. It's very low.
And a colleague of mine, Dr. Kevin Tamara, has done a lot of thinking and reading about that because it bothers him too. He's a urologist, so he kind of specializes in the male reproductive system. And he has some theories having to do with charge associated, because these are charged lipids. So there are particular features of the ovary that may, and as opposed to the testis, that may explain some of this. But it doesn't get us away from the two core things. Number one, this was known with the original data packages. The Japanese data package is essentially a historic document. It's different from what the FDA is currently looking at. So these data have been out there a long time. And yes, we have a whole lot of messaging.
But not in public view.
Within the purview, the confidential,
of the regulators,
protected, not disclosed
this is
purview.
And this is company confidential
of the regulators across the world,
but not
okay?
This
messaging that
company confidential.
Good,
so let's not get lost. Yeah, that messaging was inconsistent with these signals that were apparent, at least inside of
the regulators knew
the data
about.
Or the data.
Yeah. Okay. So
they know
we've got potential long-term. We've got short-term implications in the bone marrow. We've got potential long-term implications in the bone marrow. We have short-term implications in the ovaries. We've got potential long-term implications. I would add to the list what I've been worried about most from the beginning are autoimmune disorders that might show up in the long term. Is that plausible as you see it?
We talked about this earlier, and for me, it's less the lipid component, although that certainly has merit for autoimmune. It's more the circulating free spike protein, which we didn't expect in the literature, and we were the developers assured us this would not happen. The literature suggested we would not have free spike.
Yep.
And then Harvard and Brigham did a study in nurses, and lo and behold, we clearly have free spike after vaccination.
Yep.
And that has a whole other set of implications. But development of autoimmune disease against complexes of foreign protein plus normal human proteins is certainly something that you'd have to monitor for.
Yep.
As we were discussing, the way that's part of the reason why you typically want a 2 to 3 year follow-up period on the initial group of phase 3 patients to make sure that autoimmune consequences don't develop, because they typically take time.
Right. And this is why, they always say that there's no such thing as a vaccine that is developed fast. Like the fastest we've ever developed a vaccine has been like 7 years or.
Yeah, probably unless we go back mid-century when things were loose and fast.
Right. But there's a reason for that. It's not just that, okay, well, we didn't have the technology. We have better technology now. We still need to be able to see what the long-term effects is on a 12-year-old.
Fast forward time. And in fact, usually you use animal models to do that. And the assumptions on which the animal models bring these things to light are faulty.
Right. And how do you judge the effect on a 12-year-old?
What the animal models give us is a signal that alerts us to things that we need to follow up on carefully in humans.
Yes. Okay. So hold on. So just to make this segment clear, okay, we've got very alarming short-term stuff. We've got short-term stuff that is alarming on the basis of where we find these lipids, where we find the spike proteins. Those things are reasons for concern because it wasn't supposed to be this way. We've also got an alarming signal in terms of the hazards and deaths, or the harms and the deaths that are reported in the system. And there's a reason to think that those are dramatic underreports.
Yes, and they're all consistent with the spike distribution.
Two parts of the harm equation. Okay, the harm equation involves, there appears to be short-term harm being done at an alarming level. Long-term harm is quite plausible based on what we already know about what's taking place, but we, of course, are going to take time to figure out whether it's actually
find out, and then it's going to be too late. You can never, you can vaccinate yourself, but you can never unvaccinate.